Thank you, choir and Scott, and finest choir east of the Mississippi. That's what I'd say. Wouldn't you? Indeed, indeed. The Roman Empire at the time of Jesus Christ. That's the title of my message this morning. The Roman Empire at the time of Jesus. I'm going to invite you, if you will, to turn with me in your Bible, or you can read it off your order of service as you prefer, to the scripture reading we find in Matthew 24, verses 1 through 3. And these are the signs of the end of the age. But I want to focus on the first two verses primarily. It says this. It says, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things? He asked. I tell you the truth. Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? May God bless the reading and the hearing of his holy and sacred, immutable word this morning. Back to the beginning of the first verse there, where it says, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings, to the buildings in the temple, in other words. Do you see all these things, he said. I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. He was talking about the Roman Empire who would come in 70 AD, some 40 years after he died and was resurrected and went back to heaven. The Roman Empire would come down and destroy the city of Jerusalem. And the Romans and their army would tear down every single stone from that temple and cast it down to the ground. That's what happened. That's what he was predicting, prophesying. That's what's going to happen, he said. He told his disciples. And of course they asked him, well, when is that going to happen? Let me describe for you the beauty of the temple. I love this description of it. Listen to what it says about this. It says, they came, meaning the disciples, they came to call his attention to the splendid building and to the sumptuous decorations of the temple, intending to suggest what a piteous calamity that such a grand structure might be destroyed. He was telling them it's going to be torn down. Indeed, as the whole temple was built at the greatest cost and magnificence, so nothing was more stupendous than the uncommon size of the stones, some of which in the foundation were more than 60 feet long. If you can imagine that, 60 feet. That's a long distance. That's as far as from here back to the back there. And maybe a little bit more. Some were longer. The stones were of the whitest marble, over 65 feet long, 7 feet high, and 8 feet across. Huge. Indeed, the marble of the temple was so white that according to Josephus, it appeared at a distance like a mountain of snow. The gilding of its external parts, especially when the sun shone upon it, rendered it a splendid and beautiful spectacle. At the size of these stones and the beauty of the work, it is said that Titus, the Roman general, was astonished when he destroyed the temple in 70 AD, at which time his soldiers plundered it and took away the, quote, gifts with which it was adorned. These were rich and valuable items which were dedicated to it, and either laid up in it or hung on the walls and on the pillars of it. These included the golden table given by Pompey the Great, and the spoils which Herod had dedicated, and especially the golden vine, which was a gift of his as well, besides the multitudes of other valuable things which were greatly enriching and ornamental. On leaving the temple, which is the third verse, on leaving the temple, Jesus descended into the valley of Kidron and ascended the opposite slope, which is the Mount of Olives. And he's sitting over there on the Mount of Olives with his disciples. And the temple is in full view. They can see it over in the distance. And it says, the temple rose with its colonnade of dazzling white marble, surmounted with its golden roof and pinnacles resting on its huge stones. Beautiful sight. One we could not even comprehend. It's magnificent. I've been there, I've seen those stones. They are huge, they are enormous. You say to yourself, how did they ever erect those? It's like the pyramids in Egypt. We can't comprehend how they ever did that. Some form of block and tackle perhaps, who knows what. A lot of manpower. But Herod the Great, the bad actor in the Bible, one of the bad actors, built that temple. He built a number of things in and around Jerusalem, all through the land of Israel. Herod was a builder. Let me give you some background about the Roman Empire and what they did in Israel, and also the culture of Israel today. Caesar Augustus, we know, was the emperor of Rome at this time, of the time of Jesus' birth. He had reigned from 27 years before Christ, and he reigned up until 14 AD, 14 years after the birth of Christ. And he ordered a census be taken. That's how Joseph and Mary came to Bethlehem. God, no doubt, had moved in his life to tell him to order that census, because God was setting the stage for the birth of his son, Jesus Christ. No question about that. The census was ordered because they wanted to raise the taxes on the people, something the Romans did frequently. The Jews paid extremely high taxes to the Romans. The Jews did not like the Romans, the Hebrews. No country that was conquered by the Romans did like them. But the Romans were ruthless. They were not kind. Oh, they were fair, but they were not genteel. And so the Jewish people began looking for a Messiah. They began taking more seriously the words of the Old Testament that we know about, the prophecies that are contained all through there. They were anxiously awaiting and hoping for a Messiah to come. You see, Israel was not an independent country. Israel had been split by the Roman Empire, had been broken up by the Roman Empire into 4 areas. Those areas were Judea in the south, Galilee in the north, Samaria over in the west, and Perea, or what we today call Palestine, over in the east, had been broken up. Israel was governed by this great king Herod, as he liked to think of himself. Herod had pretty well bought his kingship from the Roman Empire. But the Romans liked Herod. Why? Because he kept a lid on the Jews, on the Hebrews. The Hebrews were not happy, as I say, with the Roman Empire. They were inclined to rebel against it. But Herod ruled with an iron hand. He was strong and shrewd. He killed, as you know, the young boys under 2 years old at the birth of Christ. That's what we know about him and think of him often, the most. He eliminated all his rivals. He would kill anybody who even thought about taking his throne, or even members of his family. He killed his brother-in-law. They were swimming in a pool that he had erected in his palace. And he drowned the brother-in-law in that pool. It's at a place called the Herodian. The Herodian was the palace of Herod. He built fortresses all around Israel, and he built the temple. He built the temple. He built roads and a drainage system in Jerusalem. Herod was a builder. At his death, his son, Herod Antipas, became the king in 4 BC. Herod Antipas, that's the person that was reigning at the time of the trial and death of Jesus, of course. He governed both Galilee and Palestine and all of Israel. He married his brother's wife. He was bad too. And he's the one that had John the Baptist beheaded. You know the story about Salome and her dance before Herod Antipas. He was a bad actor just like his father had been. Another personality that we need to think about in the Roman Empire was Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor of Judea from 26 AD to 36 AD at the time of the trial and, of course, the crucifixion of Jesus. His job was to maintain peace and order all throughout Judea, throughout that area. Ordinarily, he lived over in Caesarea on the coast, on the Mediterranean. But at the time of Passover, he would come into the city of Jerusalem, and he would live there in Jerusalem during the Passover, because that's where the action was. That's where all the people gravitated to. And he had the power of life and death over anyone in Judea, given to him by the Roman Empire. Let me tell you a little bit about the geographical features of that area. Israel, as we know, lies at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. The area was called Canaan originally in the Old Testament. Canaan was very rich and prosperous in its farmland. And of course, it's known as the Promised Land in the Old Testament. Very fertile farming. All around, all throughout the land of Canaan in Israel today is desert. Now they have irrigated it and made it lush and green and rich, and they can grow a lot of crops there today, which they couldn't do in the time of the early inhabitants of that land. The desert is called the wilderness. We have to recognize that what we think of as wilderness being trees, they call the desert wilderness. And their wilderness, their desert, is a rocky desert. It has a lot of rocks in it. It has a lot of hills and vales and rocks and things that are not ordinarily thought of in a desert. It's not like the Sahara Desert or other deserts in the world. Many biblical figures spent time there. Of course, Jesus was tempted in the desert. We know that. He lived there for 40 days and nights during his temptation. And then you've got the Sea of Galilee, which is very prominent all throughout the Bible, but especially in the New Testament. The Sea of Galilee is basically a freshwater lake. It's 12 miles wide and 5 miles deep, 5 miles the other way. 12 by 5. That's a big lake. It's a good-sized lake, believe me. It's 800 feet below sea level. Fishing was the main occupation on the Sea of Galilee, and that's, of course, the background to a lot of the stories in the New Testament about Jesus and his disciples. Capernaum was a little town on the Sea of Galilee, but a very important town, because Capernaum is where Jesus began his real ministry after he had left Nazareth. And he adopts Capernaum as his hometown when they drive him out of Nazareth. Bethsaida is where he healed the blind man. And it's near there that he fed the 5,000. There's also a town called Tiberias very near there, named after the Roman Emperor Tiberius, who came to the throne in 14 AD. That has no biblical significance, but it's an important town today because it's a tourist town, and tourists go all throughout the region of Galilee. I've spent the night there in Tiberias. It's a beautiful little city, right on the edge of the lake, the Sea of Galilee. What happens on the Sea of Galilee is that cold air often comes in suddenly, and you don't even know it, you don't realize it. And that cold air causes a lot of turbulence. It causes the sea to froth up and become very turbulent. And that's where the stories about Jesus and the sea being rough and walking on the water and all of that come from. I've been out on that sea when it gets turbulent, and believe me, it does. I was in a big boat. They were not in a big boat when that happened. The Jordan River is the primary river in Israel. The Jordan River is the longest river in Israel. Flows south through the Galilee, down to the Dead Sea, and then further on down to the ocean. We know that temperatures often get to over 100 degrees in the summer in that area. The Israelites had to cross the Jordan River when they first came up out of the Sinai desert to get to the land of Canaan. Joshua, of course, is the story of the crossing of the Jordan River and how the river stops so that he can cross over and so forth. John the Baptist baptized in the Jordan River. He baptized Jesus there. I've been baptized in the Jordan River. It was a very significant experience for me, remarkable experience. The Dead Sea lies down about 100 miles south of the Sea of Galilee. The Dead Sea is the lowest spot on earth. It's over 1,300 feet below sea level. The Dead Sea is entirely, virtually, totally conflicted with salt. Salt. It's got some water, but it's 90% salt, just a huge amount of salt. One of my most vivid memories of Israel was when I went there one time and I saw a gentleman out in the middle of it. He was Jewish, and he was flat on his back floating, but he didn't have to float because it would hold him up whether he did anything or not. You know, floating is not hard to do. But while he was floating, he was eating a tomato because he could dunk the tomato in the salt and then eat it. And of course, he had a little bit of humor with him. I'll never forget that sight. I'll never forget that. I don't know why. The Dead Sea. That's also the site of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's where Sodom and Gomorrah were, at the Dead Sea. Right around the edge of the Dead Sea is where they are. And you can see today where they believe Sodom existed. There's some pillars there. I won't go through all that, it's too long. But these are some of the daily occupations that people undertook at that time and in that place. Fishing was predominant. Fishing was probably the most popular occupation of all. Fishermen would set out on the Sea of Galilee at night, and they would have nets that they would drag through the water behind the boat. And they would do that all night until the morning, until they got to the other shore or wherever they were going, maybe back to their home port, if you want to call it that. And there they would sort the fish out. They would put them in different baskets. They were fresh, salted, and dried fish, all kinds. And then the day would be spent repairing the nets, repairing the boats, or whatever was necessary, mending the nets and sails. Farmers were probably the second most biggest occupation there. Farmers raised a number of things. They raised grapes. Grapes were very popular there. Why? Because grapes produce wine. And the water was not potable. You couldn't drink the water. So wine was pretty much the standard. You could drink water from a spring if you found a spring, but there aren't a whole lot of springs there. So primarily they had to mix the water. Sometimes they would mix it with the wine and thereby try to get the bacteria out of it. But you can imagine that kind of living. Farmers grew wheat and barley, fruit and olives, livestock, sheep, cattle, goats, donkeys. Shepherds were important in their society. They were considered the lower class. Why? Because usually shepherds couldn't do anything else. But some of them didn't want to do anything else. They didn't want to fish, they didn't want to farm, so they became shepherds. So sometimes I think the shepherds get a bad rap. They were often poor and underprivileged. And then there were a number of craftsmen, just like we would find in our society here. Number of craftsmen who were carpenters, which Jesus was, of course, and his father, potters, weavers, blacksmiths, stonemasons, They would go to the marketplace and sell their wares in the marketplace on any given occasion or maybe every day. Apprentices would understudy these craftsmen and would learn the trade from them. Now, the apprentices were often sold as slaves between the different crafts, and they were often treated poorly. And that's why Paul says, neither slave nor free in the book of Galatians, in Galatians 3:28. He says, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Something to remember and to emphasize. Tax collectors were an important part of their society. Tax collectors didn't have to be Jewish, but ordinarily were in the land of Israel. Matthew was a tax collector. Zacchaeus was a tax collector, 2 examples. They collected taxes for Rome, not for Israel. And that's why they were so despised, so disliked. They were thought of as being as bad as the Romans. The religious occupations we've talked about a little in other times and other places. The rabbis, of course, were the key figures. The scribes were the lawyers of their day. They were the experts in the Judaic law, the Mosaic law. They taught it to the people. They settled disputes if there were disputes about how to do this or how to do that, pretty much like lawyers today. But they loved recognition and acknowledgement, pretty much like lawyers today. They were condemned by Jesus a number of times. Why? The scribes and the Pharisees, you know that illustration. The priests were the ones who did the temple duty. They were in the temple in Jerusalem. And of course they had the high priest. We know that Caiaphas was the high priest at the time of the trial of Jesus and his death. The military, the Romans had the military, and the military were everywhere in all the countries that they had conquered, and there were many. The Roman military was supreme. Now they would take conscripts, they would take even volunteers from the countries that they had conquered and meld them into the Roman army. The Jews didn't do that for the most part. They didn't want to be part of the Roman army. But the Romans did that for a good reason. They knew that if they had those people in their army that they wouldn't turn against them, or they figured they wouldn't turn against them, and for the most part they didn't. The Romans were very smart in their method of governing, very clever. Their education, the children were taught by the rabbi. He taught them about the Mosaic law, what it meant, interpretation of it, things like that. He taught them in the synagogue. We've talked about that before. They learned to read and write Hebrew there. And Jesus, no doubt, was a student in the synagogue as he was growing up. Girls did not attend school in that day. They were taught weaving and cooking and household skills and things like that, but it was a very male-oriented society. Travel was very restricted. It was hard to travel in Israel. You either had to ride a donkey or something like that, or walk. They didn't have horses for the most part. They didn't have camels. Camels were over in the desert, the far desert, Arabia and places like that. Horses the same. So pretty much donkeys were the main mode of transportation. The terrain was rough and unyielding. It was hard to traverse. Thieves were lurking in lonely spots, so you had to be careful about that. We know about the case of the Good Samaritan who was set upon by thieves. He was going down to Jericho from Jerusalem. And of course the story goes on. A family traveling by foot from Nazareth, say, to Jerusalem would take about 6 days to the Passover, whatever they were going for, or going to Bethlehem, which was about the same distance. Bethlehem is 6 miles south, of Jerusalem. It's just over 60 miles from Nazareth to Jerusalem, so you can see it's a long distance. No doubt, as they were going there, Mary and Joseph Mary was riding most likely on a donkey, Joseph was walking. on this long trip, long trek. Nazareth is a small, isolated city there. That's where Jesus grew up, in the town of Nazareth. We know that. It's 15 miles west of the Sea of Galilee, 70 miles north of Jerusalem. Has only a few hundred inhabitants at the time of his birth and growing up. There were not many people in Nazareth, not a large population there. Their main occupations were farming and crafts, carpentry, things like that. That's where Jesus, of course, started his ministry. That's where they ran him out of the synagogue, if you remember. Why? He proclaimed that he was the Messiah in the synagogue in Nazareth. And so he then went over and adopted Capernaum a little bit later as his hometown. Jerusalem had about 25,000 inhabitants, much bigger city. Jerusalem has always been the major city in Israel. It was the holy city for the Christians and the Jews later on, when Jesus came, of course. The Muslims did not come until 500 years later. 570 was when Muhammad was born. Many of the important events in Jesus' life took place in Jerusalem. And of course, Herod built that temple there. The Praetorium was the name of the place where Pontius Pilate would come and stay in Jerusalem when the Passover was going on. King David made Jerusalem the capital back around 1,000 years before Christ, when he brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. And of course, Solomon built the first temple there. Capernaum is a small fishing town up on the Sea of Galilee. I'm going to do a sermon on that in the near future. So many miracles and events in the life of Jesus took place in and around the town of Capernaum. And the synagogue that he spoke in is still there today, even though it's now in ruins, of course. Where Peter's mother-in-law lived also, her house is there, restored, of course. These are just a few of the highlights of that remarkable place. Bethlehem, of course, is a small town, was a small village in Judea, nondescript, but it was the birthplace of David. And that's why, of course, it's so important in terms of the birthplace of Christ. I'll give you just a little bit of the housing situation and how they lived. And then the Israelites lived in houses made of stone or timber or plaster, very simple houses. Houses that usually had only one room where everything occurred, where they cooked and slept and everything else. Most had this one main room, but they also had a ladder that went up to the roof. And they had a flat roof that was made of beams covered with mud or grass or clay or a combination of the three. We know the story of David and Bathsheba, and we know that David was looking down from the palace, and he saw Bathsheba on her roof. That's why why did they do that? The simple reason is those houses were very hot. I told you it got up to 100 degrees or more sometimes in the summer. The houses virtually had no windows. Why? Keep out the elements. It gets cold there sometimes. They even have snow in Jerusalem, for example. And it gets hot in the summer. So people would go up on the roof at night in the summer to sleep. And that's why there were flat roofs. Some families had stables for their sheep and goats. I'll give you a quick rundown on the foods that they ate. Pretty standard foods like we would have, bread, fish, lamb. They had some cattle, but not many. Why? They sacrificed the bulls. And if you sacrifice bulls, you're not going to have many cattle, are you? Stands to reason. They had a few chickens, not too many. They had cheeses and fruits and nuts and grapes and figs. Jesus cursed the fig tree, of course. They had olives. Olives was a major crop for them. They loved olives. They had locusts. They'd eat wild locusts. We know John the Baptist did. Pomegranates, something that we have, but we don't eat very often. They had vinegar and honey and things like that, but they, remember, had no refrigeration. So it all had to be brought in the same day if it was something that would spoil. Anyway, there are so many other aspects of this. I've mentioned the water that contained bacteria that they couldn't drink unless they found a spring or treated it with some other element. Let me finish with the religious practices and beliefs, which we're pretty familiar with. The Roman Empire was polytheistic. They had gods everywhere, all kinds of gods. Of course, the Jews, the Hebrews, were monotheistic. They believed in one God, our God, the God that we follow. Their Sabbath began at sunset on Friday and ended at sunset on Saturday. Still true to this day. The synagogue, we know, is where they went to worship and study the law. And the prayer hall in the synagogue, they had a prayer hall there, always faced Jerusalem. No matter where the synagogue, it always faced Jerusalem. They had it designed that way. I could go on, but there's so many factors and so many influences in the life of Jesus and how he grew up. Think about it. We grew up in wherever we're born. And of course, that's important to us. But these factors all influenced his life. Why? Because God had ordained that. That's where God wanted him to be and to come from. This is a time that I invite anyone who wishes to give your heart, soul, and life to Jesus Christ, or who wishes to come and recommit your life, to rededicate your life, if you'd like to do that. If you want to come and have a word of testimony or a prayer here at the altar, you're welcome to do that. I'll be standing in front. I welcome you. I'd invite you to come at this time as the choir comes and as we rise to sing this hymn of invitation. Will you stand with me?